television. Um, my father was a fur trader in northern China, and my mother and he lived mostly in China. But they did come back when I was born, and they did come back 3 years later when my sister was born. I have a sister named Judith who lives in Maui with her family, and then they went back to China, and then my father died, and then my mother came back when I was 6, my sister was 3, and then started a series of peregrinations. I mean, we had been left with relatives, more or less, and there was a weird childhood, and we ended up, my sister and I, with my mother, who was very much a part-time mother, and a nanny in Tucson, Arizona. And that's where I spent a good part of my childhood. And then when I was 12, my mother met a very glamorous war veteran full of medals and shrapnel, who had been in the American Air Force and come in with originally actually the Eagle Squadron. He had joined up in 1940 and was with the Eagle Squadron, which is part of the RAF, and then when the Americans came into the war, he was a B-24 bomber pilot. He had been shot down 6 days after D-Day and was convalescing in Tucson. His name was Sontag. He had every medal except the Congressional Medal of Honor, and my mother married him, and she asked my sister and myself to take his name. I was 12 and my sister was 9. He did not adopt us, so I can't even really say he was my stepfather, but he functioned as a stepfather. That is to say, he was my very glamorous mother's husband. And then when I was almost 16, still 15, I left home and went to college.
Well, that's the part, if you look at your biography, just at numbers. College at 15, marriage at 17?
Yes, yeah.
A child at 19?
Yeah.
These numbers suggest what from the background you've just described?
Eagerness to get to grow up. I think childhood was wasted on me, which of course is a great pity. But I didn't particularly enjoy being a child, and I was very eager to grow up. And why was I eager to grow up? It's so funny because childhood is wonderful, and I remember my own son saying to me when he was about 15, and I was berating him for some immature piece of behavior, and he said, "You don't understand, I like being a child." Of course, he knew me so well that he knew that this would make me laugh, and he also knew me well enough, and I told him enough stories to know that I hadn't enjoyed being a child, and I wanted to be free. I associated adulthood with being free, with being able to go places and know things and meet people who would be interested in things I was interested in, because I didn't meet people like that when I was a child. I was quite self-created. So that was kind of a weird childhood. But then I, of course, think I've made up for it by having a very protracted adolescence throughout my adulthood. And I still feel, I don't know, it's that whole question of age. I really don't know. Sometimes I think, am I kidding myself? I mean, I am the age I am. I happen to be 70 years old, and then I was this age then, and that and the other. But I actually don't think it matters that much. But again, I'm sorry to keep saying more than I should, perhaps, but because every time I think of something, I think of something else. Maybe it's just very American to always think you can invent yourself, that you can make yourself up. I do feel quite self-created. I don't know. I don't know. I always have the feeling that I'm just beginning. I even have a feeling now. This book, Regarding the Pain of Others, I believe is my 16th book. And yet I really think, and maybe I'm kidding myself, of course, that I'm actually just beginning now, or I just got it. Now, the next novel, I'm really going to do what I want to do. That may be the endless illusion, of course, but that's what I feel.
Nutley, New Jersey, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Just wanted to thank C-SPAN and also Ms. Sontag for offering a voice of reason and thoughtfulness that I've not heard in the media very frequently. I was wondering if you've noticed a correlation between some of the terminology being used to describe the acts of violence that we're experiencing lately in terms of terrorism, or the terminology wrapped around terrorism. I've noticed a correlation between that terminology and also the terminology used, I would think, in the 19th century in terms of savage behavior, or describing certain peoples as savages and their acts as savage against what were then really colonial powers.
Well, I find that all the polarizing language, all the language that turns situations into two opposites, I believe almost as a matter of principle that has to be a distortion. It has to be a simplification. And it's just not a principle, it's actually something I experience. I always want to break down those oppositions. Two words that seem to me very, very poisoned, and one should try not to use them, are civilization and barbarism. It's a very easy way to mobilize people and to say, you know, the way people started saying right after 9/11, right after September 11, you know, well, this is an attack on civilization itself. I mean, I'm on record, and I was much attacked for it, for right away in the day or two after the attack on September 11th, for saying, let's not, you know, be so self-righteous. Of course, what has happened is a monstrous crime, an atrocity, but we must not simply wrap ourselves in the mantle of civilization and say that those who attack us are barbarians. That's too easy. And in an awful way, it mirrors the language of the other side. I mean, the radical Islam and that revolutionary current which is going through the world and which mobilizes many people is absolutely a language of polarized opposites, you know, the believers versus the infidels and so on. I think, you know, let's say, how do we understand our privilege? How do we understand how privileged we are and how this looks like to the rest of the world? The rest of the world does not necessarily think that a world ruled by the United States would be an ideal situation. There are other cultural options. What do we have in a world in which the United States cannot be stopped in whatever it chooses to do is a dangerous situation. I mean, you might say, and there's an argument that a great many uses of American power have been benevolent. Let's say World War II is the easiest example. That certainly was a case in which what the United States did was positive, largely positive. I exempt, of course, the incineration of the Japanese cities and the terror bombing of the German cities, but by and large, the United States was certainly on the right side in World War II. But a country which has an overwhelming supremacy, military and economic, so far exceeding anything known in world history, not to mention anything existing on the planet today, cannot expect always to act like angels. It's very corrupting, I should say, to have so much power. There should be countervailing powers, and that's something that we should want, instead of proclaiming the rest of the world irrelevant if they don't follow America's orders. The world and the United States, I think, would be a better place if there were several centers of power. That's not in the works right now. We are in a situation when America is on the threshold, if current policies prevail, if we don't walk into a disaster now in Iraq with situations far out of our control, in which we're going to see further and further extension of imperial might. And I think this country will change, and I think it will not change for the better.
Salt Lake